The US government has frozen nearly all the foreign currency reserves of Afghanistan's central bank. It has also stopped shipments of cash to the country. The move follows the halting of aid to Afghanistan by a number of Western governments. But as Mobin Nasir reports, they're walking a tightrope between restricting the Taliban's access to funds and ensuring that hundreds of thousands of Afghans in need of assistance can receive it.
The rapid advance of the Taliban has left the US and many other governments in shock. President Joe Biden has admitted that his administration did not expect the Afghan government to collapse so quickly, and now it's scrambling to respond.
The truth is, this did unfold more quickly than we had anticipated. So what's happened? Afghanistan political leaders gave up and fled the country. The Afghan military collapsed, sometime without trying to fight.
In a bid to restrict the militant group's access to funds, Washington has frozen the assets of Afghanistan's central bank. The vast majority of the country's foreign exchange reserves of $9.5 billion are kept at the New York Federal Reserve. Some of those funds were supposed to be dispatched to the country on Sunday, but all transfers have been halted. President Biden has authorized $500 million in aid for Afghan refugees, and officials say the money will be used to assist those who have fled to other countries. The acting governor of Afghanistan's central bank, Ajmal, Ahmady, fled the country on Tuesday. He says freezing the foreign exchange reserves will worsen economic conditions there.
As a result, the currency is likely to depreciate, inflation is likely to spike, and that's going to make it more costly for everyone to buy basic commodities such as food, wheat for bread, etc. And so, given that situation, I'm fearful for the economic future of Afghanistan.
The US and other Western governments are also pulling out aid workers and halting disbursements to the country.
As far as development is concerned, but also our stabilization measures, we have frozen these funds for the time being, because we naturally want to see how things develop in Afghanistan. We are not the only ones doing this. Other countries are too.
According to the World Bank, foreign aid funded 75% of public spending in the country last year. Stopping these flows could have devastating consequences, given that nearly half of the population already lives below the poverty line. That's likely to drive hundreds of thousands of Afghans to seek refuge elsewhere, including Europe. German Chancellor Angela Merkel says EU members must work together with Afghanistan's neighbors to ensure that doesn't happen.
We must first talk about security possibilities for refugees in the neighbourhood of Afghanistan. Then, as a second step, we can think about whether especially affected people should be brought to Europe in a controlled and supported way.
But while Western governments debate how to handle the rise of the Taliban, the plight of millions of Afghans is growing more desperate. Mobin Nasir, TRT World.
Let's speak now to Ajmal Ahmady, the exiled governor of Afghanistan's central bank and the former industry and commerce minister. He joins us from an undisclosed location to protect his security. Welcome to Money Talks, Governor. Thank you so much for joining us. Can I start with the news that the United Arab Emirates has confirmed that Afghan President Ashraf Ghani and his family has been accepted into the country on humanitarian grounds. What's your reaction to that? And do you think he should have fled Afghanistan as it was collapsing?
Thank you for having me on the program. It's a pleasure to be here. I just found out about the news as everyone else did. It was a surprise to me. I think, as I've stated previously, I feel that he shouldn't have left in the manner that he did. But my reaction is, I think it's going to, the continued issues are going to continue for the people in Afghanistan.
But there was not going to be a role for Ashraf Ghani in this new Afghanistan under the Taliban, was there?
No, absolutely not. But I think there could have been a mechanism by which there was a formal handover of power between himself. I think perhaps that such an agreement could have been negotiated.
Also, I want to ask you about these reports. Russia's embassy in Kabul says President Ashraf Ghani fled Afghanistan with 4 cars and a helicopter full of cash. And even had to leave some of that money behind because they weren't able to fit it in those cars and helicopter. The Afghan embassy in Tajikistan says Ghani fled with about $169 million in cash and has called on Interpol to arrest him. What do you make of those reports? Do you believe they're true, and what do you think should happen?
I was not involved in either in the flight or in any of the preparations for his exile, so I'm not aware of it. But the question does come up in my mind as to where he would gain such access to such funds. As I've said before, and I've published this online, all of the central bank reserves are clearly accounted for. We know exactly in which account which amount is there, and none has been stolen or taken out. And so for all the central bank reserve accounts, we can assure the people that none of that has been utilized. If there are other sources of funds that we're not aware of that he had access to, that's another story, but I found it hard to believe that you would be able to find that much hard cash available in Afghanistan, although it is a possibility.
Can I ask you more about the central bank, of which you are still technically the governor, so no one knows more about that institution than yourself. We heard in that report that the US has frozen almost $10 billion worth of funds that are being held at the US Federal Reserve. I'm wondering, what impact might that have on the incoming Taliban administration?
It's going to have an extremely large impact. When you take a look at international reserves, we had 9.5 billion. It dropped to about 9 billion during the last month. And with sanctions in place, you can say that immediately the amount of accessible reserves dropped from 9 billion to 10 million or so. So it's an extremely small fraction, let's say 0.1% of international reserves. And so with the stock of reserves having been frozen, we also have in conjunction a decline in the flow of reserves in the form of international aid being stopped. So when you put these together, it's going to cause an extreme shortage of dollars in the marketplace. It's likely going to cause the currency to depreciate, which in turn is going to have an inflation knock-on as we have high inflation pass through the currency, and that's going to cause a deteriorating environment. Remember that Afghanistan is faced with a triple shock, or it was even before this fourth shock. We had to deal with COVID, we had to deal with the conflict, and we had to deal with the drought. Now, on top of that, we also have to, or the Afghan people have to deal with the fact that the international reserves and flows have been stopped.
So in the face of those very significant headwinds, I'm wondering what you think Afghanistan's economic outlook now is. We spoke about in our previous program the country's potential, economic potential, given Afghanistan's vast mineral resources. What's your outlook for the Afghan economy going forward?
In the immediate term, the outlook is not positive. You're likely to see a GDP contraction, inflation on the rise, and the currency depreciating. The things that you talk about, such as mineral resources or other types of exports, those could provide support in the medium term, but there has to be an immediate action plan to deal with the immediate scenario, and then we can talk about potentially mining or other sectors to support the economy over the medium term.
Now, as we know, this is very early days. No one knows how a new Taliban-led government will look like, who will be involved in the government, who will run the country's institutions like the central bank. I'm wondering if the Taliban, for some reason, asks you to stay on, would you accept that, and would you return to the country?
I think the central bank has employees who have worked there for decades in some cases. It's a strong institution with a strong number of human capital base, and I think there are many others who could take over the reign of that institution, and I would try to support them as best as possible.
Okay, Ajmal Ahmady, the governor of Afghanistan's central bank and former industry and commerce minister. We'll have to leave it there, but thank you again for joining us on Money Talks.